Hello, my name is Courtney Hungenberg, and this is my presentation on the muscular system. I'll be going over the muscular system as it relates to the diaphragm in the body. We'll be getting to that later on. So there are three different types of muscle. Skeletal, which is the muscle that attaches to your bones and aids in the movement of the body. Then there's cardiac muscle, which is in the heart, and it helps move the blood through the body, get that pumping action. And then smooth muscle, which typically lines your visceral organs. It can also be called visceral muscle. And it functions to move, say, like food through the digestive system. So every type of muscle functions in the movement of something through the body or the movement of the body itself. Muscles work through the contraction and relaxation of the muscle fibers. Here's a good little graphic that kind of shows what each type of muscle looks like underneath the microscope and where you could find that muscle. I'm going to be focusing a little bit on skeletal muscle today, as it is the majority of the muscle in the muscular system. So the skeletal muscle attaches to the bones to move the skeletal system. I kind of went over that earlier. And each muscle in the skeletal system is broken down into smaller and smaller units. So you've got your fascicles to your fibers, broken down a little more as your myofibrils, broken down a little more to each unit of the muscle is a sarcomere. Muscle movement would not be possible without contraction of the muscle, and there's a very specific way that those muscle contractions work. The sarcomeres, those individual units, they contain myofilaments called actin and myosin. These are oppositely charged filaments, and then there's regulatory proteins called tropomyosin and troponin, and those regulatory proteins keep the actin and myosin from binding when they're not meant to. So when you ask your arm to move, or if you're taking a breath, your brain is going to send motor neurons to the muscle fibers to a place called the neuromuscular junction, and that's where the nerve first hits that muscle. It excites the neuron, which causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is a part of each skeletal cell, sort of like the endoplasmic reticulum, but in skeletal muscle cells. And it causes that sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium ions. Those calcium ions, they bind to the regulatory proteins, which allows the myosin heads to bind to the actin. And it'll bind to the actin, sliding it across, causing a contraction. Here's a very handy diagram of what happens during muscle contraction. You can see those myosin heads. You can see the calcium in purple binding to those regulatory proteins, and then the myosin heads are able to cross over and connect to the actin, and then it like strokes it back and slides it across to form that contraction before it finally detaches to allow relaxation of the muscle when you're not using it anymore. So on to the muscle I want to focus on, which is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a very thin but a very large muscle, surface area wise, that sits beneath the lungs and the heart, so inferior to the lungs and the heart, but above the stomach, and it's in between your ribs and your spine. It's ahead of the spine and behind the ribs. It's controlled by the phrenic nerve from the brain. It contains two main pieces: the peripheral muscle made of skeletal muscle tissue. This radial muscle, it originates on the ribs, the sternum, and the spine, and then it goes out towards the dense collagen connective fibers where it's the central tendon that's an insertion point for the muscle. Because the diaphragm is so large and it kind of acts as this barrier between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity, it needs to have holes for certain important tubes to travel through. So one of those passageways is the esophageal opening, which allows the esophagus to go through. The aortic opening for the aorta, which is the largest of the blood arteries, and it brings the oxygenated blood into circulation from the heart. And then the caval opening that lets the inferior vena cava pass through on its way back to the heart, bringing the deoxygenated blood. I mostly chose this picture of the diaphragm to show those passageways so you can see where the vena cava, where the aorta, and where the esophagus go through. Also, it makes it clear to see that this muscle is so large it fills up the entire space between the ribs and the spine. It's that big, and it's that much of a separator between the cavities. So because the diaphragm is made up of skeletal muscle cells, what you'd see under the microscope would be like any other skeletal muscle. You can clearly see the striations when looking into the microscope. You can see that A band, which is the dark area of the myosin filament, and it's where the myosin filament and the actin filament intersect. And then the I band is the light area where that actin filament is not next to the myosin. It's that space where they're not overlapping. And then the H zone is where there's only myosin. And the Z discs are very clear indicators of where each sarcomere ends. Another thing you can see about skeletal muscle when you're looking in a microscope is that it's multinucleated. So that's something to definitely look out for when you're looking at the diaphragm through a microscope. The diaphragm has a lot of important functions to a lot of different systems throughout the body. The number one most important thing the diaphragm does is it makes respiration the most effective it can be, and it just makes it possible. It makes those deep, nice deep breaths possible. So when the diaphragm contracts, it flattens, and it flattens so that it's not up against the lungs, and it moves the lungs down so that they can gain volume, and it creates this vacuum where the lungs are able to suck in the most air possible. And then when the diaphragm relaxes and returns into its original state, kind of up into the lungs, the air is expelled. The abdominal muscle is the antagonist to the diaphragm, helping in respiration, and the intercostal muscles are the synergists. So the synergist muscles are helping, and the antagonists are trying to prevent it, not consciously, obviously, because they're not alive. But anyway, they are working against it while the synergists are working with it. The diaphragm also has minor functions for other systems of the body, such as the digestive system. Where the esophagus goes through and that esophageal passageway, the esophageal opening, the diaphragm will put pressure on the esophagus, and it keeps the acid from coming up, and it keeps acid reflux from happening. It also increases abdominal pressure on the rest of the digestive system, as well as the kidneys, bladder, whatnot, to help expel vomit, feces, and urine. Another system that it helps is the circulatory system. or the cardiovascular system, because it puts pressure on the vena cava to push the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. By the time all that blood goes to the body and it's coming back to the heart, it just needs that extra push from the diaphragm to work against gravity to get all the way back to the heart. So the way the diaphragm helps maintain homeostasis is actually pretty cool. If the brain senses that the body is not getting enough oxygen, it can send a signal through the phrenic nerve, down to the diaphragm that will tell the diaphragm to either lift up or to drop. So if that diaphragm flattens out and drops down and the ribs move out, the volume of the lungs increase and it lowers the pressure so that air can flow in, so that even more oxygen is flowing in. When the diaphragm moves up, the volume decreases and creates a higher pressure system where air is expelled out. So this keeps the body getting the ideal amount of air to maintain homeostasis. There's a difference between breathing with just your chest and breathing with your diaphragm. It's important to breathe with your diaphragm because that's the most efficient way of getting the oxygen that you need for maintaining homeostasis. If the diaphragm stopped working, which the diaphragm can stop working, it's not usually an issue with the diaphragm, it's more of an issue with the phrenic nerve. I would imagine that it would cause a lot of difficulty breathing. It would cause the complete inability to take nice deep breaths, and it would also cause a difficulty in regulating blood oxygen content. An actual disorder that is caused by the diaphragm and affects the diaphragm, and even more it affects the lungs, is called congenital diaphragmatic hernia. And this happens in fetuses, newborns, little humans that are developing. And it happens when an organ from the abdominal cavity travels through one of those holes in the diaphragm and it starts to invade into the thoracic cavity. It can be seen through ultrasound, but sometimes it's diagnosed after the baby is born and they notice the baby is having trouble breathing. They need to find this out very quickly. This congenital defect has a mortality rate that's pretty high, of 45 to 50%. So it needs to be treated very quickly, probably through surgery, and it can cause an issue even after being corrected with surgery, in that the left lung can be completely underdeveloped from all these organs pushing up on it and it not having room to grow properly. Here's a photo of how a normal infant looks. They've got the diaphragm that's doing its job properly. It's separating those cavities. All the thoracic organs, the lungs, the heart are on top, and all the abdominal organs, the stomach, the intestines, the liver, are down below. Unfortunately, when a baby has congenital diaphragmatic hernia, those intestines can move up, the liver can move up, it can all move up through the hole in the diaphragm and push on the lungs, push on the heart, and that left lung gets the brunt of it and becomes completely underdeveloped, and this is what causes such a high mortality rate among infants with this disorder. So as you can see, the diaphragm is absolutely crucial in maintaining homeostasis. Without the oxygen-rich air that the diaphragm is helping the lungs breathe in, creating that vacuum, the rest of the muscular system wouldn't have the power to move the body. Also, the diaphragm has probably the biggest overall effect on the most amount of systems. It helps the circulatory system, it helps the respiratory system, it helps the rest of the muscular system. It's absolutely crucial to human life and is probably one of the most important muscles that we have. So that has been my presentation, and thank you so much.